Millionaire CEO lived with a shattered heart for 6 long years until he saw his ex's locket hanging around the necks of one of 2 identical little girls. A very powerful story, but before proceeding, don't forget to like, subscribe and comment. I love Mr. Peter. Let's start with love. Some men measure their lives in achievements, but Steve Isaac measured his in the red pins, scattered across a map of America, each one marking a place where his heart had stopped and then shattered when the woman he found wasn't her. The wall of his private investigator's office told a story that nobody wanted to read, a chronicle of obsession that had consumed every waking moment since that morning when he'd reached across the bed and found only cold sheets where Arabella Pal should have been. The search had started simple enough. He'd called her phone until the number disconnected. He'd gone to her apartment and found it emptied, like she'd never existed there at all. He'd talked to her roommates who claimed they knew nothing, her professors who said she'd simply stopped coming to class, her few friends who looked at him with something between pity and suspicion. Within a week, he'd hired his first investigator, and that's when simple became complicated, when hope became addiction, when love transformed into the kind of madness that people whisper about behind closed doors. "There's another lead," his investigator said, sliding a folder across the desk, with the weary resignation of a man who'd watched his client chase ghosts for longer than either wanted to admit. Woman matching her description, registered for a community arts program grant. "Same city you searched before, different neighborhood." Steve picked up the folder with hands that wanted to shake but had learned stillness through repetition of disappointment. Inside were grainy photographs of a woman teaching children to paint, her profile turned away from the camera, her hair caught in sunlight that made it look like the midnight silk he used to wind around his fingers. He'd learned not to trust photographs, learned that hope was the cruelest drug, and he was an addict past the point of rehabilitation. "How many times have I searched that city?" Steve asked, though he already knew the answer because he knew every city, every street, every dead end that had promised her and delivered nothing. 3 times. But this is a different part of town, not the areas we covered before. The timing matches too. She applied for this grant recently, which means she's active in that community right now. Steve stood and walked to the map on the wall, touching the cluster of pins that marked his previous searches in that city. He remembered the woman in the bookstore who'd had Arabella's smile but wrong eyes. He remembered the teacher whose laugh had made him follow her for 2 blocks before she turned around and shattered his hope with a stranger's face. He remembered standing in the rain outside an apartment building because someone had seen a black woman with a similar build, and he'd waited for hours until she emerged and wasn't her, and he'd driven back to his hotel and broken everything in the room that could be broken. "Book the flight," he said, and his investigator nodded without argument because they'd had this conversation hundreds of times, and the ending never changed. The memories came without invitation during the flight, vivid and merciless. He remembered the night they'd met at a scholarship ceremony his mother had dragged him to, how Arabella had given a speech about breaking cycles of poverty through education, and he'd been struck not by her beauty, but by her fire. She'd looked at him afterward and said, "I know exactly who you are. Your family's fortune was built on displacing people who looked like me, and instead of being offended, he'd been fascinated by someone who refused to be impressed by his name or his wealth or the privilege he'd worn like invisible armor his entire life. Their relationship had been secret from the beginning because his mother made it clear that family legacy mattered more than personal happiness. And Arabella had agreed not because she was ashamed, but because she wanted to protect what they had from a world that would try to destroy it. They'd met in hidden corners of the library, in coffee shops across town where nobody knew them, in his apartment when his roommate was gone. She'd challenged every assumption he'd ever made about the world, forcing him to see beyond the bubble of privilege he'd lived in. And he'd fallen so completely in love with her that everything else became background noise. That final night haunted him more than all the others combined. She'd shown up at his apartment with something desperate in her eyes. Something that looked like goodbye, even though he didn't understand it yet. They'd made love with an intensity that felt like drowning. Like both of them were trying to memorize something they knew was ending. She traced his face in the darkness and whispered, "I love you." And he'd fallen asleep, holding her like she was the answer to every question he'd never known to ask. Morning had brought devastation. Empty bed, empty apartment, her student ID card, the only proof she'd ever been there at all. He'd called until his voice went hoarse, searched until his body collapsed from exhaustion, filed police reports that went nowhere because adults have the right to disappear. His mother had sworn she knew nothing about Arabella's departure, had actually seemed relieved that the relationship had ended. And he'd almost believed her until suspicion became certainty, and certainty became another reason for rage. The investigators he'd hired over the years had become a parade of the same promises, wrapped in different packaging. Each one swore they'd find her, each one chased leads that dissolved like smoke, each one eventually admitted defeat and recommended he move on. But moving on required accepting she was gone. And acceptance felt like betrayal of everything they'd been to each other. His assistant had stopped trying to schedule dates with appropriate women, his mother suggested. His friends had stopped inviting him to social events because he'd cancel if someone called with potential information about Arabella. His entire life had narrowed to this singular obsession that everyone said was destroying him. And maybe they were right. But the alternative was admitting she'd simply chosen to vanish, and that was a truth too devastating to accept. The city looked the same as it had during his previous searches, indifferent to his pain, filled with people living normal lives while his remained frozen in that moment of waking alone. He drove to the address from the investigator's file, hands gripping the steering wheel with enough force to make his knuckles white, and told himself this would be another dead end because hope was the enemy and disappointment was the only constant he could trust. The community art center sat on a corner in a neighborhood that had seen better decades, its windows bright with children's paintings taped to the glass. He parked across the street and sat there trying to breathe through the anxiety that made his chest feel like it was collapsing inward. Through those windows, he could see people moving, children laughing, someone gesturing with animated passion while teaching a class. And then she walked past the window. Steve's vision tunneled until there was nothing except her profile. The curve of her neck, the way she moved that was burned into his memory like a brand. She was real. She was there. She existed in the world and wasn't just a ghost. His desperate mind had conjured from loneliness and longing. He sat in his car for 3 hours, unable to move, terrified that if he went inside, she'd disappear again, that this was another cruel trick his mind was playing. His investigator arrived and took photographs, ran facial recognition software that came back with percentages that meant nothing, because Steve already knew with certainty that defied logic. Children started leaving the center in clusters, parents picking them up with the casual ease of routine. The lights inside stayed bright, and through the window he could see her cleaning paintbrushes, moving around the space with the comfortable familiarity of someone who belonged there. 2 small girls burst out of a back room, identical twins with wild curls and bright laughter. They crashed into Arabella with the unself-conscious joy of children who knew they were loved, and she knelt to their level and smiled at them with tenderness that made Steve's throat close around air that wouldn't come. One of the twins wore something around her neck that caught the light as she spun, a locket, gold and delicate and painfully familiar because he'd given that locket to Arabella with both their pictures inside, a promise neither of them had kept. Steve watched the child touch the locket while talking to her mother, and the timeline that had never quite made sense suddenly clicked into devastating focus. He counted backward in his mind despite trying not to, calculated possibilities he didn't want to face, and the mathematics of biology delivered a truth that made him grip the steering wheel hard enough to hurt. Those weren't just any children. Those were his daughters. and Arabella had spent years hiding them from him while he'd torn the world apart searching for her. The rage that filled him was cold and precise, nothing like the hot, desperate anger of the early searches. This was calculated fury, born from understanding that she hadn't just left him. She'd stolen his children, taken years of their lives he could never recover, robbed him of being a father while he'd been destroying himself trying to find her. He got out of the car, finally. His legs unsteady, his heart beating so hard it felt like violence against his ribs. The door to the arts center opened with a cheerful bell that mocked the magnitude of this moment. Inside smelled like paint and clay and childhood, and Arabella looked up from where she was helping one of the twins wash brushes. Their eyes met across the room, and her face drained of color so completely he thought she might collapse. Her hand reached for the counter to steady herself, and the terror in her expression didn't make any sense, because he wasn't the one who'd left. He wasn't the one who'd disappeared. He wasn't the one who'd been living a lie. "Steve," she whispered, and his name in her mouth after all these years sounded like prayer or curse, and he couldn't tell which. Chapter 2. The Woman Who Ran from Love. Arabella's world had been built on the fragile foundation of distance and secrets, and watching Steve Isaac walk into her arts center felt like watching the ground open beneath her feet. She'd known this moment would come eventually because the universe didn't allow people to run forever, but knowing hadn't prepared her for the reality of seeing him again, for the way her body remembered his presence before her mind could catch up. "Children, go to the back room and play quietly," she managed to say with a voice that almost sounded steady, and the kids scattered with the obedience of students who sensed adult tension they didn't understand. Mara and Lara lingered near her legs, watching this strange man with curious wariness, and she wanted to shield them from what was coming, but knew it was far too late for protection. Steve stood frozen near the entrance, and Arabella used those seconds to really look at him, to catalogue the changes that time had carved into his features. He'd always been handsome in that effortless way of people born into privilege, but now he looked haunted, like something essential had been hollowed out and never refilled. His eyes held shadows that hadn't been there before, and the set of his jaw spoke of anger barely contained behind a mask of control. "Why?" The single word cut through the space between them with surgical precision. "Why did you destroy me?" Arabella sent the twins to join the other children, with promises she'd come get them soon, waited until their footsteps faded, and then locked the front door because this conversation needed privacy, even though she wanted witnesses to delay the inevitable reckoning. She turned to face him, and the words she'd rehearsed 1,000 times in her mind dissolved because no speech could adequately explain what she'd done. "I was pregnant," she said finally, and watched those 2 words detonate in his expression like explosives. "The night before I left, I found out I was carrying your child. I was terrified and alone, and I didn't know what to do. So you ran." His voice was soft in a way that made it more dangerous than shouting. "You were pregnant with my child, and you disappeared without giving me a chance to be part of that decision. Your mother came to see me." The confession felt like pulling shrapnel from an old wound. "She found me before I could tell you, showed up at my apartment with photographs and documents and threats wrapped in polite words." Steve's expression shifted from fury to confusion. "My mother swore she didn't know where you went. She helped me search for you." Arabella laughed without humor, a sound that tasted bitter on her tongue. "Your mother is an excellent liar. She came to me with pictures of you with another woman, told me you were engaged to someone from an appropriate family, showed me forged documents that made it look like you'd called me a phase you were getting over. She had recordings too. Phone conversations, she claimed, were you telling friends I was just entertainment, nothing serious. She played them for me, and the voice sounded exactly like you. She said if I really loved you, I'd disappear and let you live the life you were meant to have." And you believed her? The accusation hung heavy between them. You believed I'd say those things about you? She didn't just tell me, Steve. She showed me evidence that looked irrefutable. The photographs had metadata, the documents had what looked like your signature verified by experts she brought with her. And those recordings... Arabella's voice broke. They sounded exactly like you. Your voice, your speech patterns, everything. She'd clearly hired someone who could mimic you perfectly, but I didn't know that then. She also showed me medical records, proving you had appointments scheduled for fertility testing with your supposed fiancé, bank statements showing you'd been planning to buy a house with someone else. Every single piece of evidence was fabricated, but it was so detailed, so professional, so overwhelming. Steve's face had gone pale. She went that far? She had an entire presentation prepared, Steve, hours of documentation. She told me your phone was being changed to a new number the next day as part of the engagement announcement, which is why I couldn't call you. She said if I tried to contact you, she'd have me arrested for harassment and make sure I lost any chance at finishing my degree. She wasn't just threatening me. She had a lawyer there who explained exactly how they'd destroy me legally if I didn't comply. I was a scholarship student from nowhere, and she was offering me money to disappear along with threats of complete destruction if I stayed. What was I supposed to do? You were supposed to trust me. His control finally cracked, voice rising to fill the empty center. You were supposed to come to me and ask if any of it was true, instead of making decisions about my life without my input. Even if she changed my number, you could have shown up at my apartment, left a note, found a way. I tried! Arabella's own voice rose to match his. I went to your apartment that night after she left, planning to tell you everything despite her threats. But when I got there, I saw a woman leaving, the same woman from the photographs she'd shown me. She was wearing an engagement ring and crying, and when she saw me, she said, "You must be the girl he's been trying to let down gently." I'm sorry. I didn't know he was still seeing you when he proposed to me. Your mother had staged the entire encounter, but I didn't know that. I stood outside your building for hours, Steve, hours, trying to convince myself to go up there and confront you. But I was pregnant and alone, and every piece of evidence pointed to you being engaged to someone else. So I made the choice to believe the worst, because believing the best felt like setting myself up for devastation. So you took that belief and used it to steal my children? Steve moved closer, and Arabella could see the pain radiating off him like heat. You didn't just leave me, Arabella. You took my chance to be a father. You erased me from their lives before I even knew they existed. I know. The admission felt like swallowing glass. I know what I did was unforgivable. I've lived with that guilt every single day. But I thought I was protecting them, protecting you, protecting all of us from a family that would never accept us. That wasn't your decision to make alone. Steve's hands clenched at his sides, like he was physically restraining himself from reaching for her or the walls. You should have let me fight for you, for us, for them. Instead, you decided I was too weak or too selfish to choose my own family over my mother's approval. The truth of his words cut deep because he was right. She'd made assumptions about his character based on fear and his mother's manipulation, and those assumptions had cost them both everything. She'd been a coward dressed up as a martyr, telling herself she was being selfless when really she'd just been too afraid to fight. I tried to call you, she said quietly, knowing it was inadequate defense. In the first months after I left, I picked up the phone so many times. But every time I started to dial, I'd remember that woman with the engagement ring, those recordings of your voice, all that evidence your mother had presented. And I'd convince myself that calling would only hurt you more, that I was doing the right thing by staying away. You should have called anyway. Steve's voice broke slightly, and hearing his pain laid bare was worse than his anger. Do you have any idea what I went through trying to find you? I hired investigators, searched every city, followed leads that went nowhere. I've spent years destroying myself looking for you while you were here raising my children in secret. I saw you once, Arabella confessed, the memory rising unbidden. 2 years after I left, I was in a grocery store and I saw you in the parking lot. You looked so lost, so broken, and I almost ran to you. But then I thought about your mother's threats, about how finding out about the twins might complicate your life, and I got in my car and drove away. I've regretted that moment every day since. Steve stared at her with something that looked like horror. You saw me searching for you and you hid? What kind of person does that? A terrified one. The tears finally came, despite her resistance. A person who'd convinced herself that loving you meant staying away, that the kindest thing I could do was let you move on without the burden of children you never planned for. Those children weren't a burden. Steve's shout echoed in the empty center. They were mine. They are mine! And you stole them from me like I had no right to know they existed. A sound from the back room reminded them both that those children were close enough to hear raised voices, and Steve lowered his volume, but not his intensity. Where are they? I want to meet my daughters. Steve, we need to do this carefully. They don't know about you. They've never had a father in their lives, and suddenly introducing you. I don't care about your concerns for careful introductions. His words were ice. You lost the right to control this situation when you kept them secret. Either bring them out here, or I'll go back there myself. Arabella recognized the futility of arguing and walked to the back room on legs that felt like they might give out. Mara and Lara looked up from their coloring with identical expressions of concern, and she knelt before them, trying to figure out how to explain something that had no good explanation. There's someone I want you to meet, she said gently. He's someone Mama knew a long time ago, and he's very important. Is he the sad man from before? Lara asked, with the perceptiveness that always startled Arabella. The one who made you look scared. Mama's not scared, sweetheart. Ma's just surprised. Come on, let's go say hello. The twins followed her back to the main room, where Steve waited with barely contained emotion written across his features. He knelt when he saw them approaching, bringing himself to their eye level, and Arabella watched her daughters study this stranger with the cautious curiosity of children who'd been taught to be wary of people they didn't know. Hello, Steve said softly, and his voice shook despite obvious efforts at control. My name is Steve. What are your names? I'm Mara, the bolder twin announced, stepping slightly in front of her sister with protective instinct. And this is Lara. Are you a friend of Mama's? I was, Steve said carefully. A long time ago, your Mama and I were very close. We cared about each other very much. Then why did you make her scared? Lara asked from her position slightly behind her sister. We heard you yelling, and Mama doesn't like yelling. The question seemed to devastate Steve more than any accusation Arabella could have thrown at him. I'm sorry you heard that. Your Mama and I have some things we need to talk about, but I promise I'm not trying to scare anyone. Mara's hand went to the locket around her neck in a gesture that had become habit, and Steve's eyes tracked the movement with laser focus. That's a beautiful necklace. Can I see it? Mara looked at Arabella for permission, and at her mother's subtle nod, she stepped closer to Steve and opened the locket. Inside was a photograph of a younger Steve, smiling with the carefree happiness of someone who hadn't yet learned how much life could hurt. Mama gave us these, Mara explained. She said they're special and we should take care of them always. I have this one with the man in it, and Lara has the one with Mama's picture. Steve's hand shook as he touched the locket, and when he looked up at Arabella, his eyes held devastation that transcended anger. You kept this. All these years you kept the locket I gave you. I split it between them, Arabella whispered. I wanted them to have pieces of both of us, even if they didn't understand why. Do you know who this man in the picture is? Steve asked Mara gently, and the little girl shook her head. Mama says someday she'll tell us the whole story. She says he was very important to her, but that's all we know. Steve stood abruptly, his emotions clearly overwhelming his ability to maintain composure in front of the children. He looked at Arabella with something that combined rage and anguish in equal measure. We're not done. not even close to done. But I can't do this right now with them here. Steve, please. No. He cut her off with a single word. You don't get to ask me for anything. Not after what you've done. I'll be back tomorrow, and we're going to figure out what happens next. But know this, Arabella, those are my daughters, and I'm not walking away from them the way you walked away from me. He left without looking back, the bell above the door ringing cheerfully in complete contrast to the devastation he'd left behind. Mara looked up at Arabella with confusion written across her small features. Mama, who was that man really? And why did you both look so sad? Chapter 3. The Daughters He Never Knew. Steve returned to his hotel and systematically destroyed everything breakable in the room. And when the rage finally exhausted itself, he collapsed on the bed and cried for the first time in years. The tears came from a place so deep he didn't know it existed, mourning not just the woman he'd lost, but the father he'd never gotten to be, the years stolen from him, the first words and first steps and birthday parties that happened without him. His phone rang with his investigator asking for updates, and Steve managed to say the words that felt impossible. I found her. She has children. My children, twin daughters. I've been searching for her while she was raising my daughters, and I didn't even know they existed. What do you want me to do? Find out everything about her life since she left. Every job, every apartment, every struggle. I want to know what she's been doing while I was falling apart, trying to find her. Within 2 days, the file arrived, and Steve read it with growing understanding that didn't erase his anger, but complicated it. Arabella had worked multiple jobs during her pregnancy, had given birth alone in a hospital with no family present, had raised the twins while finishing her degree remotely and building the arts center from nothing. The financial records showed poverty he couldn't imagine, eviction notices barely avoided, medical bills she couldn't fully pay. The neighbors described a devoted mother who never complained despite obvious struggles. The file included photographs of her teaching children with passionate engagement, playing with Mara and Lara in parks with broken equipment, sitting alone after her daughters were asleep with weariness etched into every line of her body. Steve stared at these images and tried to reconcile his fury with the reality that she'd suffered too. She'd been alone and terrified, manipulated by his mother's lies, and she'd made terrible choices out of fear rather than malice. The understanding didn't forgive what she'd done, but it provided context that shifted his perspective. He returned to the arts center the next morning, arriving early enough to watch through the windows as Arabella prepared for the day's classes. The twins helped her with the unself-conscious helpfulness of kids who'd been raised to contribute. And Steve watched his daughters interact with their mother and felt the loss acutely. When Arabella saw him standing outside, she came to unlock the door. Her eyes held shadows that suggested she hadn't slept. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "Somewhere private where the girls can't hear." Arabella led him to a small office, and they sat across from each other with a desk between them that felt inadequate as barrier. "I had investigators look into your life," Steve began, watching her flinch. "I know about the poverty, the struggles, how hard it's been raising them alone. I'm not without empathy for what you've been through. But," Arabella supplied, "but understanding why you did something doesn't make it forgivable. You stole my children from me. You made a unilateral decision that I was better off not knowing they existed, and that decision cost me years I can never get back." "I know." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I've known since the moment I walked away that what I was doing was wrong, but I convinced myself it was necessary. They weren't unwanted." Steve's control slipped. "How dare you assume I wouldn't have wanted my own children? Your mother told me you'd resent them eventually." She painted a picture of slow destruction. "I believed her because I was scared and alone, and she was very convincing. And you never once thought to verify any of it with me." Arabella's hands twisted in her lap. "I thought about it constantly. But I was pregnant and terrified, and she offered me money to disappear. I took it because I had no choice." Steve leaned forward. "Where is that money now?" In an account I've never touched, except for the twins' medical expenses when I had no other option. I saved the rest because I kept telling myself someday I'd find the courage to return it, to tell you everything. But you never did. The statement hung between them like an accusation. No, I never did. Because I'm a coward who chose the easy path of hiding over the hard path of honesty. Steve studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or deception, but found only exhausted honesty. I want to meet them properly. I want you to tell them who I am and why I haven't been in their lives. And then I want to spend time with my daughters without you hovering. Steve, they're just children. We need to do this gently. I've given them enough time. Years of time I didn't know they needed. Now it's my turn to be their father, and you don't get to dictate the terms anymore. Arabella stood as well, desperation creeping into her voice. Please don't take them from me. They're all I have. I know I don't deserve mercy, but they need their mother. And they need their father too. I'm not interested in taking them away from you. I'm interested in being part of their lives in the way I should have been from the beginning. They returned to the main room where Mara and Lara were drawing. Arabella called them over and knelt to their level, and Steve watched her gather courage for a confession he knew was destroying her. Girls, I need to tell you something important about the man from yesterday. His name is Steve, and he's your father. The twins processed this with straightforward logic. Mara looked between her mother and Steve with dawning understanding. The man in my locket is our daddy. Yes, sweetheart, that's your father. He didn't know about you until now because Mama made a mistake and didn't tell him you existed. Why not? Lara asked with devastating simplicity. Don't daddies want to know about their children? Arabella's voice broke. This daddy would have wanted to know very much. Mama was scared and made a very bad choice. Daddy's been looking for us for a long time, and now he's found us. Mara studied Steve with serious eyes that looked unsettlingly like his own. Are you going to leave again? The question hit Steve in the chest. No, I promise I'm not going to leave. I didn't know about you before, but now that I do, I'm going to be here. If you'll let me. Lara walked up to Steve with boldness and looked up at him with evaluation that seemed far too mature. Mama cries sometimes when she looks at your picture in the locket. She thinks we don't notice, but we do. Have you been crying too? Steve knelt and looked his daughter in the eyes. Yes, I've been very sad for a long time because I missed your mama and didn't know about you and Mara. But now I found you, and maybe we can all stop being so sad. Okay, Lara said with casual acceptance. You can be our daddy then, but you have to promise not to make Mama cry anymore because we don't like it when she's sad. I promise to try my best, Steve said, and meant it despite the anger still burning in his chest. Mara joined her sister in front of Steve, both twins studying him with cautious hope. Can we hug you? Mara asked. That's what daddies and daughters do on TV. Steve opened his arms, and his daughters stepped into them, and the simple gesture broke something fundamental in his chest. He held them carefully, terrified of doing something wrong, and when they pulled back, both girls were smiling. Do you want to see my painting? Mara asked, already pulling him toward her easel. Over the following days, Steve spent every possible moment with Mara and Lara, learning their personalities. Mara was bold and impulsive, while Lara was thoughtful and observant. They taught him their favorite games and showed him their artwork with pride that made his chest ache. Arabella maintained distance during these visits, allowing space for relationships to form. But the anger remained, simmering beneath surface pleasantries, because knowing his daughters didn't erase the years of their lives he'd missed. Every story they told about their past was a reminder of his absence. One evening, after dropping the twins back at Arabella's apartment, he confronted her on the street outside. I want to know everything about my mother's visit to you. Every word she said, every document she showed you, every threat she made. Arabella looked exhausted in the streetlight. She came to my apartment the night before I left you. She had photographs of you with another woman at events I'd never heard of. Documents that looked like they had your signature saying I was a mistake. Detailed stories about your engagement to someone from an appropriate family. And you believed all of it without question. She was very convincing, Steve. She had proof that looked real, and I was a scared, pregnant girl from nothing facing down a woman with unlimited resources. Yes, I believed her. Steve pulled out his phone and showed her his investigator's findings. My mother's been lying to both of us. She knew where you were. She's known about the twins since they were born. She's been systematically keeping us apart. Arabella read the report with growing horror. She knew? All this time, she knew about your daughters and never told you. And she helped me search while knowing exactly where you were. She's been playing us both. The revelation hung heavy between them. Steve's phone buzzed with a message that made his blood run cold. My mother wants to meet her granddaughters, he read aloud. She's threatening legal action if I don't allow it. She says she has rights as their grandmother. Arabella's face went pale. You can't let her near them. She'll try to take them away from me, use her money and connections to paint me as an unfit mother. Steve looked at the woman who'd betrayed him and the mother who'd been manipulating them both. She's not getting anywhere near our daughters. I don't care what she threatens. Our daughters, Arabella repeated softly. That's the first time you've said it like that. They are ours, Steve said firmly. And maybe it's time we stopped fighting each other and started protecting them from the person who's actually been destroying us all along. Chapter 4. The Mother Who Destroyed Them. The family estate looked exactly as Steve remembered from his childhood. Imposing and cold, designed to impress rather than welcome. He'd sworn he'd never return here after his last argument with his mother, but protecting his daughters required facing the woman who'd orchestrated their separation. Arabella sat beside him in the car, hands twisted in her lap with nervous energy, and he could feel her terror radiating in waves. You don't have to come inside, Steve said, though they'd already had this argument twice. I can handle my mother alone. She manipulated both of us for years. I deserve to hear whatever lies she tells directly instead of filtered through your report. Arabella's voice was steady, despite the fear in her eyes. Besides, she wanted to meet the twins. I need her to understand that's never happening. They walked to the door together, and Steve noticed his mother had been watching from the window because she opened it before he could knock. She looked exactly as she always had, elegant and cold, her smile practiced and empty of warmth. Her eyes passed over Steve dismissively and landed on Arabella with unconcealed disdain. So you finally crawled out of whatever hole you've been hiding in, his mother said to Arabella without preamble. I'm surprised it took you this long to chase after his money. We're not doing this on the doorstep, Steve cut in before Arabella could respond. You wanted to talk about your granddaughters. Let's talk inside. His mother led them to the formal sitting room, and Steve remembered every uncomfortable moment he'd spent in this space being lectured about family obligations and appropriate behavior. Arabella sat on the edge of her chair like she might need to run, and his mother settled into her usual seat with the air of a queen granting audience. I want to meet my granddaughters, she began without pleasantries. I understand you've kept them secret, but now that they've been discovered, I have rights as their grandmother. You have no rights, Steve said flatly. You forfeited any claim to family when you manipulated us both and kept my children secret from me. His mother's expression didn't change. I did what was necessary to protect you from a disastrous decision. She was using you, obviously trying to trap you with a pregnancy, and I simply accelerated the inevitable separation. Except she was actually pregnant, Steve said with barely controlled fury. And instead of telling me about my own children, you let me search for her for years while knowing exactly where she was. You have no proof of that accusation. His mother's voice was ice. And even if I did know her location, Keeping you apart was in your best interest. Look at you now, throwing away your future for mixed-race children who will never be accepted in our circles." Arabella flinched at the casual racism, and Steve saw red at the edges of his vision. "Those mixed-race children are your granddaughters, and the fact that you can't see their value tells me everything I need to know about your character." "Character?" His mother laughed without humor. "I'm trying to protect our legacy from being diluted by someone who saw you as a meal ticket. She took money to leave you, Stephen. That tells you exactly what kind of person she is." "I took that money because I was pregnant and alone and terrified," Arabella said quietly, speaking directly to his mother for the first time. "You came to me with lies and threats and convinced me that telling Steve about the pregnancy would destroy him. I believed you because I loved him enough to want to protect him, even if that meant sacrificing my own happiness." "How noble," his mother sneered. "And yet you kept his children secret for years while struggling in poverty. If you really loved him, you would have told him the truth and let him decide what to do." "You're right," Arabella said, and the admission seemed to surprise his mother. "I should have told him. I should have trusted him more than I trusted your manipulation. I made terrible choices out of fear, and I've regretted them every day. But at least my mistakes came from love and terror. Yours came from prejudice and cruelty." His mother's face hardened. "I want to see those children. They have legal rights as their grandmother, and I will pursue every avenue available to ensure I have access to them." "Go ahead," Steve said calmly. "Pursue whatever legal action you want. I have evidence of your manipulation, proof that you knew about my daughters and deliberately kept them from me. Any judge who hears that story will side with parents trying to protect their children from a toxic grandmother." "You think you can win against me in court?" His mother's voice dripped with condescension. "I have resources you can't imagine. Lawyers who will tear apart her character and paint you as unstable. I'll destroy both of you and take those children into proper custody, where they'll be raised correctly." "You won't get anywhere near them," Arabella said with surprising strength. "I've lived in poverty and worked myself to exhaustion keeping my daughters safe. You think your money scares me? I've already survived the worst thing you could do, which was taking away the man I loved and forcing me to raise our children alone." Steve watched Arabella face down his mother and felt something shift in his chest, some recognition of the strength she'd been forced to develop through suffering. His mother noticed his expression, and her face twisted with disgust. "You're choosing her over your family, over everything I've built for you?" "You didn't build anything for me," Steve said quietly. "You built a prison of expectations and called it legacy. I'm choosing my daughters because they're actually my family. You're just the woman who gave birth to me and spent my entire life trying to control me." His mother stood abruptly. "Get out, both of you. And when my lawyers contact you about custody proceedings, remember that you chose this path." "We're leaving," Steve agreed, taking Arabella's hand without thinking about the gesture. "But understand this clearly. If you come anywhere near my daughters, if you try to contact them or interfere in their lives in any way, I will use every resource I have to destroy you. The evidence I have of your manipulation will go public, and everyone will know exactly what kind of person you really are." They left without looking back, and Steve didn't release Arabella's hand until they reached the car. She was shaking, with adrenaline and residual fear, and he found himself wanting to comfort her despite the anger he still carried. "She's going to try to take them away from me," Arabella said, as he drove away from the estate. "She has money and connections, and I have nothing. A court might decide they're better off in her custody or yours alone." "That's not going to happen." Steve's voice was firm. "I meant what I said in there. She's not getting near our daughters." "Our daughters," Arabella repeated again, like the phrase was still foreign to her. "I keep waiting for you to correct yourself, to remind me that I forfeited my right to call them ours. But you're their mother. Whatever happened between us, you've been raising them and loving them and doing everything you could to give them a good life. I'm angry about the years I missed, but I'm not interested in taking them away from the only parent they've ever known." Arabella started crying silently, tears streaming down her face without sound, and Steve pulled over because he couldn't drive while she fell apart beside him. She covered her face with her hands and sobbed with the release of someone who'd been holding everything in for too long. "I'm sorry," she managed between gasps. "I'm so sorry for everything I did to you, for the pain I caused, for the years you missed with them. I know saying it doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know that I've regretted every single day since I left you." Steve wanted to stay angry, wanted to hold on to the rage that had sustained him through their initial confrontations, but watching her break down over choices she'd made out of fear and manipulation made it impossible to maintain pure hatred. He reached over and pulled her hands away from her face, forcing her to look at him. "I'm still angry," he said honestly. "I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive you for what you took from me. But I'm starting to understand why you did it, and that's something. We can't change the past, but we can figure out how to move forward for Mara and Lara's sake." "What does moving forward look like?" Arabella asked through tears. "How do we co-parent when you hate me?" "I don't hate you," Steve realized with surprise. "I want to hate you because it would be simpler than this complicated mess of anger and understanding and residual feelings I don't want to examine. But hate requires less effort than what I'm actually feeling." "What are you feeling?" Steve looked at this woman who'd destroyed him and survived her own destruction, and he couldn't find simple words for the tangle of emotions she created. "I don't know yet. But I know I don't want to spend the rest of our daughter's childhood fighting. They deserve better than parents who can barely stand to be in the same room." Arabella nodded slowly. "So what do we do?" "We figure it out together. We protect them from my mother's threats. We build something that works for their sake, and we try to find a way to not destroy each other in the process." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a fragile beginning. They drove back to the city in silence that felt less hostile than exhausted, and when Steve dropped Arabella at her apartment, he surprised himself by saying, "I want to take the girls somewhere tomorrow. Just me and them, without you hovering nearby. Can you trust me with that?" Arabella hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Where are you taking them?" "I don't know yet. Somewhere they'll enjoy, somewhere we can just be father and daughters without all the complicated history weighing us down." Okay," Arabella said softly. "But Steve, thank you for standing up to your mother, for choosing them over her." "There was no choice to make," Steve said simply. "They're my daughters. Everything else is just noise." He drove away, leaving Arabella standing on the sidewalk, and in his rearview mirror he watched her disappear into her building. For the first time since finding her, he felt like maybe they could survive this. Maybe they could build something functional from the wreckage of their past. But first, he needed to address the immediate threat his mother represented. And that was going to require resources and strategy he hadn't needed to employ yet. His phone rang with his investigator asking about the confrontation, and Steve summarized the meeting while his mind raced through possibilities. His mother was dangerous with money and connections, but she'd made one critical mistake. She'd underestimated his determination to protect his daughters and Arabella's strength in adversity. "I need you to gather everything on my mother," Steve said. "Every manipulation, every lie, every document that proves she knew about my daughters and kept them from me. I want a case so airtight that no judge would even consider giving her access to Mara and Lara." That's going to take time and money," the investigator warned. "I have both. Just get it done." Steve ended the call and sat in his car outside his hotel, thinking about how his life had transformed in such a short time. Weeks ago, he'd been obsessed with finding Arabella, convinced that locating her would somehow fix everything broken inside him. Now he'd found her and discovered he had daughters, and his mother was threatening legal warfare, and nothing was fixed at all. If anything, everything had become more complicated. But looking at the photograph of Mara and Lara on his phone, seeing their smiles and their innocence, he knew with certainty that whatever complications arose, they were worth fighting for. His daughters were worth protecting, even if that meant going to war with his own mother. And maybe, somewhere in the midst of that protection, he and Arabella could find a way to stop being enemies and become partners in raising the children they'd both love and both failed in different ways. It wasn't the reunion he'd imagined during all those years of searching, but perhaps it was the one they both needed. The question was whether his mother would allow them that chance, or whether she'd destroy them all trying to maintain control over a family that had already slipped through her fingers. Chapter 5. The Crisis That Brings Clarity. Steve picked up Mara and Lara early the next morning, finding them dressed and waiting with eager anticipation. Arabella hovered near the door with obvious reluctance to let them go, and he recognized the fear of a mother giving up control for the first time. "We'll be fine," he assured her quietly. "I promise to keep them safe." "Be good for your father," Arabella said, hugging both girls fiercely. "Mama will be fine," Mara said with exasperated patience. "Daddy's not going to let anything bad happen to us." The casual way she said "Daddy" made Steve's chest tighten, and he caught Arabella's eye over the twins' heads and saw her own emotional reaction to their daughter's acceptance. He took them to a park with elaborate playground equipment. Watching them play with unbridled joy, he tried to memorize every detail because he'd missed so many moments already. Mara was fearless on the climbing structures, while Lara preferred the swings, both occasionally looking back to make sure he was watching. "Are you and Mama going to get married?" Mara asked suddenly during lunch, her question delivered with blunt directness. Steve nearly choked on his sandwich. "That's complicated, sweetheart. Your mama and I have a lot of things we're still figuring out." "But you love her, right?" Lara chimed in, her perceptive eyes studying his face. "We see how you look at her sometimes when you think nobody's watching." "Real life is messier than movies," Steve said gently. "Sometimes people hurt each other, even when they love each other, and fixing that hurt takes time." "But you're not angry anymore, right?" Mara's face showed worry. "I'm still working through my feelings, but I'm not angry at you and Lara. You two are perfect, and I'm grateful I get to be your father now." They spent the afternoon at a children's museum where Mara and Lara explored with enthusiastic curiosity, and Steve found himself enjoying fatherhood in ways he'd never anticipated. These were his children, and watching them discover the world filled him with purpose he'd been missing for years. It was late afternoon when Lara complained of feeling dizzy. Steve assumed she needed food or rest, but when her face went pale and she swayed on her feet, alarm bells started ringing. He caught her before she collapsed, and Mara started crying with panic. "I need to get her to a hospital," Steve said, already moving toward the exit with Lara in his arms. She felt too light, too fragile, her breathing shallow and her skin clammy. He called Arabella from the car, trying to keep his voice steady, though terror was clawing at his throat. "Lara's sick. I'm taking her to the hospital. Meet me there." "What happened? Is she okay?" Arabella's voice climbed with maternal panic. "I don't know yet." She just collapsed. "Just meet me at the emergency room." The hospital was chaos of fluorescent lights and antiseptic smells. The staff took one look at Lara's condition and rushed her back for evaluation, leaving Steve in the waiting room with Mara sobbing against his chest. "Is Lara going to die?" Mara asked through tears, and the question destroyed him. "The doctors are helping her right now. They're going to figure out what's wrong and make her better." Arabella burst through the emergency room doors, looking wild with terror. She ran to Mara and pulled her daughter into her arms, while Steve stood apart, feeling helpless. What happened? Arabella demanded once Mara's crying subsided. We were at the museum, and she complained of dizziness. Then she just collapsed. I brought her straight here. This isn't your fault, Arabella interrupted. Children get sick. You did exactly what you should have done. They waited in terrible silence. Steve paced while Arabella held Mara, grief and fear making everyone equal. A doctor finally emerged, looking grave. Are you Lara's parents? Yes, they said simultaneously. Your daughter has a serious heart condition that appears to be congenital. She's going to need surgery, and I won't lie to you, it's risky. We need to operate soon to prevent further deterioration. The words hit like physical blows. Steve felt his legs weaken, and Arabella made a sound like she'd been gutted. Mara started crying again. How risky? Steve managed to ask, every surgery carries risks, but this particular procedure has complications we need to discuss. For now, she's stable and sedated. You can see her briefly, but then we need to prep for surgery first thing tomorrow morning. They were led to a room where Lara lay looking impossibly small in the hospital bed, connected to machines that beeped with steady rhythm. Steve stood on one side while Arabella took the other, and Mara climbed carefully onto the bed to curl against her sister. She's going to be okay, Arabella whispered like a prayer. Steve reached across the bed without thinking and took Arabella's hand, and she gripped it with desperate strength. They stood together over their daughter, united in fear and love. And Steve realized that whatever anger he'd been holding on to had become irrelevant in the face of potentially losing Lara. The night passed in terrible slow motion. They took turns sitting with Lara, while the other stayed with Mara in the waiting room. Steve found Arabella crying in a supply closet around midnight and held her while she broke apart. I can't lose her, Arabella sobbed against his chest. She's my baby. They're both my babies, and I can't survive if something happens to her. She's not going anywhere, Steve said with more confidence than he felt. She's strong like her mother. She's going to fight through this. Arabella nodded against his chest, and they returned to their daughter's bedside. The surgical team came in the pre-dawn hours to explain the procedure, and both parents listened with growing horror at everything that could go wrong. Do whatever you need to do to save her, Arabella said when the surgeon finished. Cost doesn't matter. Just save my daughter. Our daughter, Steve corrected gently, and Arabella met his eyes with gratitude. They wheeled Lara away just after sunrise, and Steve held Arabella while she watched their daughter disappear through surgical doors. Mara clung to both of them, and they formed a knot of shared terror until a nurse guided them back to the waiting room. The surgery took hours that felt like years. Steve and Arabella barely spoke, lost in private fears they couldn't articulate. Mara fell asleep on Arabella's lap, exhausted from crying, and Steve covered them both with his jacket. I've been thinking, Arabella said quietly, about all the time we've wasted being angry and hurt, about how stupid our pride seems when our daughter is fighting for her life. I've been thinking the same thing, Steve admitted. None of it matters as much as I thought it did. All that matters is Mara and Lara being okay. Do you think we can find our way back to each other? Arabella asked, her voice barely audible. Steve didn't answer immediately. I don't know, but I know I don't want to spend the rest of our daughters' lives fighting. And I know that somewhere under all the hurt and anger, I still care about you more than I want to admit. Arabella's tears fell silently, and Steve reached over to wipe them away. We don't have to figure everything out right now. Let's just focus on getting Lara through surgery. The rest can wait. The surgeon emerged finally, and both parents stood with identical expressions of desperate hope. The surgery went well. She's stable and in recovery. The next 24 hours are critical, but if she makes it through without complications, her prognosis is good. The relief was so overwhelming that Arabella's legs gave out, and Steve caught her before she hit the floor. They held each other and cried with the release of parents who'd been holding their breath for hours. And when Mara woke and saw them crying, she joined in without understanding whether these were tears of joy or sorrow. "Lara's okay," Steve told her. "Your sister's okay." They were allowed to see her briefly, and Lara looked peaceful in her post-surgical sleep, breathing steadily with machines monitoring her progress. Steve and Arabella stood on either side of her bed again, and this time, when he reached for her hand, it felt less like offering comfort and more like claiming connection. "We're going to get through this," he said to both Arabella and himself, "all four of us together." And for the first time since finding her again, he believed they actually might. Chapter 6. The Healing That Changes Everything. Lara's recovery was slow and punctuated by setbacks that sent both parents into spirals of renewed terror. Steve and Arabella maintained constant vigil, sleeping in shifts in uncomfortable hospital chairs, eating vending machine food they barely tasted, existing in suspended animation while their daughter fought her way back to health. Mara stayed with them most days, quiet and subdued in ways children shouldn't be, drawing pictures for her sister and whispering encouragements to her sleeping twin. The medical bills started arriving with shocking totals, and Steve handled them without discussion, paying whatever was necessary while Arabella watched with complicated gratitude. She'd spent years struggling to afford basic health care, and watching him write checks that would have bankrupted her multiple times over highlighted the vast gulf between their circumstances. "I can't repay you for this," she said one evening, while they shared coffee in the hospital cafeteria. "The surgery, the specialists, all of it. She's my daughter," Steve said simply. "You don't repay parents for taking care of their children. That's just what we do. But I kept you from being able to do it for years." Steve set down his coffee and looked at her directly. "Can we stop keeping score? You made terrible choices out of fear and manipulation. I've been angry about that, and I probably will be for a while longer. But Lara almost died, and that put everything in perspective. Fighting about the past won't change it." Their tentative truce deepened over the following days as they navigated Lara's recovery together. They learned to communicate about medications and doctor consultations, to support each other through moments of panic when her vitals changed. The hospital staff started treating them as a unit, directing updates to both parents simultaneously. Mara noticed the shift and commented with blunt observation, "You and Mama don't look so sad anymore when you're together. Does that mean you're not fighting?" "We're learning how to not fight," Steve answered carefully. "That's different from everything being fixed, but it's progress." "Good," Mara said with satisfaction, "because Lara needs us all to not be sad when she wakes up properly." Lara's first truly coherent conversation happened late one night when only Steve was in the room. Her eyes opened with more awareness than previous wakings, and she looked at him with recognition that made his chest tighten. "Daddy." Her voice was raspy from the breathing tube they'd only recently removed. "You stayed?" "Of course I stayed. I'm not going anywhere." Steve moved closer to her bedside. "How do you feel, sweetheart?" "Tired. My chest hurts." She paused, gathering energy. "Is Mama here too?" "Dee, she's getting coffee. She'll be back in a minute. We've both been here the whole time, taking turns so someone's always with you. Both of you together." Lara's perceptiveness hadn't been dulled by surgery and medication. "You're not fighting anymore." "We're trying not to. You and Mara are too important for us to keep being angry at each other." Lara smiled weakly. "Good. I was worried you'd hate each other forever, and we'd have to choose sides like my friend whose parents don't talk." The casual revelation that his daughter had been worrying about parental conflict while fighting for her. "Life broke something in, Steve. You will never have to choose sides. Lara, whatever happens between your mama and me, we're both going to love you and Mara. That's never going to change. Promise?" "I promise." Steve took her small hand carefully. "Now rest. Your body needs to heal." When Arabella returned minutes later, he told her about the conversation, and she cried quietly while watching their daughter sleep. "She shouldn't have to worry about us. She should just get to be a child." then we make sure that's all she has to worry about going forward. No more fighting in front of them, no more tension they can pick up on. Can we do that? Arabella asked with genuine uncertainty. We have to try. For them, we have to try. Lara was released from the hospital after 2 weeks, with strict instructions for rest and gradual activity increases. Steve arranged for them to stay temporarily in a house he'd rented outside the city, someplace quiet where Lara could recover. The house had separate bedrooms for everyone, but shared common spaces, and the arrangement forced them into proximity that sometimes felt uncomfortable, but was necessary for coordinated care. The routine they developed was oddly domestic. Steve cooked breakfast while Arabella handled medications and morning vitals. They took turns reading to Lara during her mandatory rest periods, while the other entertained Mara. Evenings found them all together, watching movies or playing quiet games. The twins thrived under the attention of both parents, and watching his daughter's joy, Steve felt the weight of resentment he'd been carrying start to shift. One night after both girls were asleep, he found Arabella on the back porch staring at stars. She looked exhausted and beautiful, and Steve remembered with painful clarity why he'd fallen in love with her in the first place. "Can I join you?" he asked, and she nodded without speaking. They sat in silence for several minutes before Arabella said, "I've been thinking about the night I left you, going over it obsessively, wondering if there was a moment where I could have made a different choice." And there were 1,000 moments. 1,000 times I could have chosen trust over fear, honesty over cowardice. Your mother's manipulation worked because I let it work, because part of me already believed I wasn't good enough for you. That was never true, Steve said quietly. You were always too good for me. I was the one who'd lived in privilege without questioning it. You challenged me to be better, and I was terrified of disappointing you. I wish I'd known that then. I wish I'd believed you loved me enough to choose me over your family's expectations. I would have, Steve said with certainty. I would have walked away from all of it for you, but you never gave me that chance. I know, Arabella's voice broke, and I can't ever give you back what I took. Those years with Mara and Lara, watching them grow and change. I stole that from you, and there's no way to make it right. No, there isn't, Steve agreed, and the honesty seemed to hurt her more than anger would have. But maybe we can make the years going forward count double. Maybe we can build something good enough that eventually those missing years won't hurt quite so much. Do you really think that's possible? After everything I did to you, can you really imagine a future where we're okay? Steve looked at her in the starlight, this woman who destroyed him and survived her own destruction and felt the complexity of everything she made him feel. I don't know what our future looks like, but I know I don't hate you anymore. I know that watching you with our daughters makes me remember why I loved you. And I know that if we're both willing to try, maybe we can find something worth having. I'd like to try, Arabella said softly. If you're willing to let me. One day at a time, Steve said. We figure it out one day at a time, and maybe eventually we'll look up and realize we've built something real. Arabella reached for his hand tentatively, and when he didn't pull away, she wove her fingers through his. They sat like that under the stars while their daughters slept inside, and Steve felt possibility stirring in his chest where anger used to live. The peace was shattered the next morning when Steve's lawyer called with news that his mother had filed for grandparent visitation rights and was claiming that Arabella was an unfit mother due to poverty and instability. The legal documents painted a picture of negligent parenting and suggested that the children would benefit from regular contact with their paternal grandmother. She's actually doing this, Arabella said when Steve told her, her face pale with renewed fear. She's going to try to take them away. She's not going to win, Steve said with conviction he hoped was justified. My lawyers have evidence of her manipulation. No judge is going to give her access after hearing what she did. You don't know that. She has money and connections, and I have a history of running away. What if the court sides with her? Then we fight, together. We show them that you're an incredible mother who made one terrible decision years ago when you were scared and alone. We show them that Mara and Lara are loved and cared for and thriving. And we make it clear that my mother's interest isn't in her granddaughter's welfare, but in controlling people who won't submit to her. Arabella nodded slowly, but her hands shook. I need to hire my own lawyer. I can't go into court battles without representation. Use my lawyers, Steve offered. They're already familiar with the situation, and they're the best available. I can't let you pay for that, too. Stop, Steve interrupted gently. This isn't about money or debts. This is about protecting our daughters from a woman who wants to hurt us through them. Let me help you, please. Arabella looked at him with such gratitude it made his chest ache. Thank you for standing with me instead of against me. I know you have every right to side with your mother and try to take custody yourself, but you're choosing to support me instead. You're their mother. You've been their mother through poverty and struggle and fear. I'm not going to let my mother or anyone else suggest you're not good enough for them. The legal battle ahead of them was daunting, but facing it together felt manageable. Steve found himself wanting to protect Arabella almost as much as he wanted to protect his daughters, and the realization surprised him. Somewhere between the anger and the hospital vigils and the shared domesticity of Lara's recovery, he'd stopped seeing her as the woman who'd betrayed him and started seeing her as his partner. That night, he lay awake thinking about possibilities he'd been too angry to consider before. What would it look like if they actually tried to rebuild what they'd had? Could love survive the kind of betrayal she'd committed? More importantly, did he want to try? The answer came when he walked past Arabella's bedroom and heard her crying quietly in the darkness. He stood outside her door for a long moment before knocking softly. When she opened it, with tear-streaked face, he didn't overthink the impulse that made him pull her into his arms. We're going to get through this, he told her while she cried against his chest. All of it. The custody battle, the recovery, everything. We're going to get through it together. Arabella nodded against him, and Steve realized with startling clarity that he wanted more than just co-parenting. He wanted her, not the memory of who she'd been, but the woman she'd become through suffering and survival. He wanted to rebuild what they'd lost and create something stronger from the pieces. But rebuilding required foundation work, and foundation work required time and trust and healing none of them had achieved yet. So he held her while she cried and made promises he intended to keep and told himself that wanting her was different from being ready for her. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and strategy sessions and preparations for legal warfare. But tonight they had this moment of shared vulnerability, and Steve held on to it like the fragile beginning it was. Chapter 7. The Battle for Family. The lawyer's office felt cold and impersonal, designed to intimidate rather than comfort, and Arabella sat beside Steve, trying not to show how terrified she was. His mother's legal team had filed documents that painted a devastating picture of negligent parenting, citing her poverty, her choice to keep the children secret, her history of running away from problems. Every terrible choice she'd made was being weaponized against her, and reading the accusations felt like being stripped naked and examined for flaws. This is character assassination, Steve's lawyer said bluntly. They're trying to make you look unstable and irresponsible, but we have evidence that contradicts every claim. Your financial situation was the direct result of raising 2 children alone without support, which you only did because of their client's manipulation. Will that matter to a judge? Arabella asked, her voice small. She has money and connections, and I have nothing but excuses for bad decisions. You have years of dedicated parenting and children who are clearly loved and well-adjusted, the lawyer countered. We also have evidence of her manipulation and proof that she knew about the children and deliberately kept them secret from their father. No judge is going to look kindly on a grandmother who prioritized control over family welfare. The legal strategy sessions were exhausting and demoralizing. forcing Arabella to relive every mistake, while lawyers dissected her choices with clinical detachment. Steve sat beside her throughout, his presence a steady anchor when she felt like she might drown in shame and fear. He defended her when the lawyers pushed too hard, reminded them that she was a person rather than a case file, and made it clear that they were fighting together rather than separately. The preliminary hearing arrived with agonizing speed. His mother sat across the courtroom, looking elegant and composed, her lawyer painting a picture of concerned grandmother worried about her grandchildren's welfare. Arabella listened to herself being described as impoverished and unstable, as someone who'd kidnapped children from their father and raised them in conditions bordering on neglect. Steve's lawyer countered with evidence of his mother's manipulation, presenting documents that proved she'd known about the twins since birth and had actively prevented Steve from finding them. The judge listened with increasing skepticism to his mother's claims of concern, while evidence of her deception mounted. "Mrs. Isaac, you're claiming you want what's best for your granddaughters, yet you spent years ensuring they and their father remained separated." The judge's tone suggested the contradiction wasn't lost on her. How does that demonstrate concern for their welfare? His mother's lawyer scrambled to explain that she'd been protecting Steve from a bad situation, but the argument fell flat when Steve himself testified that he desperately wanted to find Arabella and would have immediately claimed his children if given the chance. "Your Honor, my mother systematically destroyed my chance to be a father," Steve said with quiet intensity. "She manipulated Arabella into leaving, kept my children's secret, and is now trying to use the poverty she forced on their mother as evidence of unfitness. This isn't about my daughter's welfare. This is about control and punishment." The judge looked between Steve's mother and Arabella with an expression that suggested she'd seen enough custody battles to recognize genuine concern from vindictive maneuvering. "I'm denying the petition for grandparent visitation rights pending further investigation. Mrs. Isaac, if you truly care about your granddaughters, I suggest you focus on repairing your relationship with their father rather than attempting to interfere in their mother's custody." The relief was overwhelming. Arabella felt her legs weaken as Steve's hand found hers under the table, gripping with shared triumph. His mother's face twisted with barely contained rage, and she stood abruptly, her lawyer trying to calm her as she stalked from the courtroom. Outside in the hallway, Steve pulled Arabella into a fierce hug. "We won. She's not going to get near them." "This time," Arabella said, her relief tempered by realism. "But she's not going to stop. People like her don't accept defeat. Then we'll keep fighting. As many times as necessary." Steve pulled back to look at her face. "You're safe. The girls are safe. That's what matters." His mother was waiting near the exit, and despite the judge's ruling, she approached them with cold fury radiating off her like heat. "This isn't over, Stephen. You're throwing away your future for a woman who abandoned you and children who will never be accepted in our world." "Your world," Steve corrected. "A world built on prejudice and cruelty. My daughters deserve better, and so does Arabella. You'll regret choosing them over family," his mother hissed. "When the money runs out and the reality of raising mixed-race children sets in, you'll understand what I was trying to protect you from. The only thing I regret is not standing up to you sooner," Steve said with finality. "You're not my family anymore. You lost that right when you decided your prejudice was more important than my happiness or my children's welfare." His mother's face hardened into something ugly. "Then consider yourself disinherited. Every penny, every connection, every advantage your name carried, gone. See how long your noble love lasts when you're struggling like her." "Keep it," Steve said simply. "I don't want anything that comes with the price of your approval." They left his mother standing in the courthouse hallway, and Steve felt lighter than he had in years. The money and connections she threatened to withdraw had never brought him joy anyway. and the freedom of choosing his own family over inherited obligation was worth whatever financial consequences came. Arabella was quiet during the drive back to the house, processing everything that had happened. "You just gave up your inheritance for us. Do you understand what that means?" "It means I'm free," Steve said. "Free from her manipulation, free from expectations I never wanted to meet, free to build a life with people who actually matter to me. People like me." Arabella asked softly. "Especially like you." Steve glanced at her before returning his eyes to the road. "I know we're still figuring things out, but I want you to know that choosing to defend you wasn't obligation. It was what I wanted to do." They returned home to find Mara and Lara waiting with the babysitter, and both girls rushed to their parents with questions about where they'd been and whether everything was okay. Steve knelt and gathered both daughters into his arms. "Everything's okay. Your grandmother tried to cause trouble, but the judge said she can't bother us anymore. You're safe, and Mama and I are going to make sure you stay safe." "Is Grandma mean?" Lara asked with her characteristic directness. "You said she was your mama, but you don't seem to like her very much." "Sometimes people we're related to aren't good people," Steve explained carefully. "My mother made choices that hurt people I love, and I can't accept that. Family is supposed to protect each other, not cause harm. So Mama's part of our family now?" Mara asked hopefully. "Like all of us together?" Steve looked at Arabella over the twins' heads, and something passed between them that felt like promise. "Yes, sweetheart. We're a family, all four of us together." The girls cheered and declared that they should celebrate with pizza and ice cream, and Steve agreed, because sometimes children's simple solutions were exactly right. They spent the evening in easy domesticity that felt increasingly natural, and watching Arabella laugh at something Mara said, Steve realized he was falling in love with her again. Not the memory of who she'd been in college, but the woman she'd become through struggle and survival. After the twins were asleep, they found themselves on the back porch again, drawn to the ritual of stargazing that had become their time to talk honestly. Arabella spoke first, her voice tentative. "What you said in the courthouse about choosing to defend me because you wanted to. Did you mean that?" "Every word," Steve confirmed. "You made terrible choices that hurt me deeply, and I'm still working through that pain. But I'm starting to understand that hurt and love aren't mutually exclusive. I can acknowledge what you did wrong while also recognizing that you did the best you could with impossible circumstances. That's generous considering what I cost you. It's honest, and I need us to be honest with each other going forward if this is going to work." "If what's going to work?" Arabella asked, though her eyes suggested she knew what he meant. "This. Us. Whatever we're becoming." Steve turned to face her fully. "I want to try again, Arabella, not to recapture what we had before, because we are not those people anymore, but to build something new with who we are now." Arabella's breath caught. "Are you sure? After everything I did to you, how can you even consider trusting me again?" "Because I see how you are with our daughters. Because you've spent years in poverty rather than spend money you considered tainted. Because you faced down my mother in court despite being terrified. Because when I look at you, I still see the woman I fell in love with, just stronger and scarred and infinitely more interesting. I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Maybe not," Steve agreed, "but I'm giving it anyway, not because you've earned it, but because holding on to anger was destroying any chance we had at happiness. I'm choosing to forgive you because I want a future with you more than I want to punish you for the past." Arabella started crying, and Steve pulled her close, like he'd been doing increasingly often. She fit against him like she'd never left, and the years apart felt less important than the possibility of years ahead. "I'm scared," she admitted against his chest. "Scared I'll mess this up again. Scared you'll realize I'm not worth the effort. Scared that loving you will end in more pain." "Fear is what got us here in the first place," Steve said gently. "Your fear of my family, my fear of losing you again. Maybe it's time we choose courage instead. Maybe it's time we trust that what we have is strong enough to survive our mistakes. I want to trust that. I want to believe we can make this work. Then let's try. One day at a time, we figure this out together. Arabella pulled back to look at his face, and Steve saw his own hope reflected in her eyes. I love you. I never stopped loving you, even when I was convinced staying away was the right choice. You've been in my heart every single day we've been apart. I love you too, Steve said, and the admission felt like release. I tried to hate you, tried to convince myself that what we had was dead, but it never worked. You've been haunting me for years, and now that I have you back, I'm not letting go. He kissed her then, gently at first and then with growing intensity, and it felt like coming home after years of wandering lost. Arabella kissed him back with equal hunger, and when they finally broke apart, both were breathless. We should probably take this slow, Arabella said with obvious reluctance, for the girl's sake until we're sure this is going to work. Agreed, Steve said, though everything in him wanted to rush forward. But know that I'm sure, I'm absolutely certain I want this, want us, want the family we're building together. They stayed on the porch talking until late, making plans and sharing fears and slowly rebuilding the trust that had been shattered. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't simple, but it was honest and real and filled with possibility that felt like hope. Inside the house, their daughters slept peacefully, unaware that their parents were finally finding their way back to each other. The locket that had brought them together sat on Mara's nightstand, both halves still separated but promising eventual unity. Much like their parents, the pieces existed apart, but were destined to be whole again. Chapter 8. The Rebuilding of Love. The weeks following the court victory settled into a rhythm that felt increasingly domestic and permanent. Steve and Arabella maintained separate bedrooms in the rented house, but the boundaries between them blurred with each passing day. Morning coffee became their time to coordinate schedules and steal quiet conversations. Evenings found them side by side, helping with homework and reading bedtime stories in alternating voices. Lara's strength returned gradually, her heart healing in ways the doctors called remarkable. She tired easily still, requiring afternoon rests that Mara had learned to respect. Steve used those quiet hours to work remotely, building a new foundation for his career now that his mother's connections and inheritance were gone. Arabella watched him adapt to diminished circumstances without complaint and loved him more for choosing their family over wealth. The Arts Center reopened with Steve's financial backing, transformed into something larger that could serve more children. Arabella resisted his help initially, proud and worried about owing him more than she already did, but he insisted that investing in her dream was investing in their community. The compromise had him as silent partner who provided resources without control, respecting the work she'd built alone. Mara noticed the shift in her parents' relationship before they officially acknowledged it. "You smile at each other differently now," she'd said. "Like you're keeping happy secrets." One evening, while Arabella was putting the twins to bed, Lara asked the question both girls had clearly been discussing. "Are you and Daddy going to get married?" "Because we think you should, and Mara and I voted and it was unanimous." Arabella smiled at her daughter's serious expression. "Marriage is complicated for adults, sweetheart. We're still figuring out how to be together after being apart for so long. But you love each other, right? We can tell you do, even when you think we're not paying attention." "Yes, we love each other very much." "Then the rest is just details," Lara pronounced with confidence. "You love each other, you're both our parents. You should just be a family officially." Arabella returned downstairs to find Steve waiting with wine and an expression that suggested he'd been thinking about the same conversation. They'd fallen into pattern of sharing a drink after the girls slept, time carved out for themselves. Lara asked when we're getting married, Arabella said, settling onto the couch beside him with closer proximity than would have been comfortable weeks ago. They asked me the same thing last week, Steve admitted. I told them we were taking things slowly, and Mara informed me that adults overcomplicate everything. Our daughters are unnervingly perceptive. They get that from their mother. Steve's hand found hers naturally. But maybe they're not wrong. Maybe we are overcomplicating this because we're both scared of getting hurt again. Are you scared? Arabella asked, surprised. Terrified, Steve confessed. Not of loving you, because that's already happened, but of building something with you and having it fall apart. Of our daughters growing attached to the idea of complete family only to watch it splinter if we fail. I'm scared of the same things. I destroyed us once before and I know you've forgiven me, but what if I mess up again? Steve turned to face her fully. Then we deal with it together. I don't want to co-parent from separate houses, Arabella. I want to wake up next to you and go to sleep beside you and build a life that's ours in every sense. Are you asking me to move in permanently? I'm asking you to marry me. Steve pulled a small box from his pocket, opening it to reveal a simple ring that was beautiful without being ostentatious. Not because our daughters think we should, though their voting record is persuasive, but because I love you and I want to be your husband, and I'm done pretending that taking things slow is anything but fear, disguised as caution. Arabella stared at the ring with tears streaming down her face. Steve, I don't deserve this. I kept your children from you for years. Stop punishing yourself for the past. Yes, you hurt me. Yes, you made terrible choices. But you also raised our daughters with love, despite impossible circumstances. You built a community program that changes children's lives. You're strong and brave and imperfect, and I love every complicated piece of you. I'm afraid of losing you again. Then hold on tighter this time. Say yes, and trust that we're strong enough to survive whatever comes. Say yes, because you love me and I love you, and our daughters deserve to see their parents choose each other every single day. Arabella looked at this man who'd searched for her for years, who'd forgiven the unforgivable, who'd chosen their family over wealth and legacy. Yes, she said through tears. Yes, I'll marry you. Steve slid the ring onto her finger and kissed her with intensity that spoke of years of longing finally finding resolution. They held each other on the couch, where they'd spent countless evenings learning to trust again. A sound from the stairs made them break apart to find both twins watching with barely contained excitement. We heard, Mara announced with satisfaction. We were supposed to be asleep, but this was more important. You're getting married. Lara squealed, running down to crash into both parents. We're going to be a real family officially. We've been a real family, Steve corrected gently. But now it'll be official in ways that involve cake and fancy dresses. The twins bounced with excitement, and Arabella caught Steve's eye over Mara's head with a look that said everything words couldn't capture. They'd survived betrayal and loss, and years apart, they'd fought their way back to each other through anger and fear and hard-won forgiveness. Planning the wedding became a family affair, with Mara and Lara offering opinions on every detail. They wanted small and intimate, gathering only people who'd supported them through the hardest times. His mother was conspicuously absent from the invitation list, and neither discussed the absence because her loss was her own doing. The ceremony took place in a friend's backyard, surrounded by flowers and people who loved them. Mara and Lara served as flower girls, wearing matching dresses and the united locket that Steve had finally put back together. Both halves joined after years of separation. Arabella wore a simple dress that made her look radiant, and when she walked towards Steve through rows of chairs, he saw their entire journey reflected in her face. The fear she'd carried, the strength she'd developed, the love that had survived despite every obstacle. The vows they wrote themselves were honest about their past and hopeful about their future. Steve promised to choose her every day, despite the pain she'd caused, to forgive without keeping score, to build a family where love mattered more than legacy. Arabella promised to never run again, to face problems together instead of alone, to trust his love even when fear whispered lies. They promised their daughters a home where they'd be safe and loved and free to be exactly who they were meant to be. When Steve kissed his bride, Mara and Lara cheered louder than anyone, and the celebration that followed was filled with joy that felt earned through suffering. "I searched the whole country for you," he said against her ear while they danced. "Years of false leads and disappointments. And the entire time, you were hiding in plain sight." "I wasn't hiding from you," Arabella said softly. "I was hiding from myself, from the choice I'd made and the consequences I couldn't face. Finding you again forced me to stop running. And now I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. With you, with our daughters, building the life we should have had all along." They danced until the twins demanded attention, then spent the evening surrounded by people who'd witnessed their journey and celebrated their triumph. It wasn't the fairy tale ending Arabella had dreamed of in college, but it was real and hard-won, and infinitely more valuable for having been fought for. Later that night, after guests departed and twins were asleep, Steve and Arabella stood together, looking at their daughters through the doorway. Mara and Lara slept peacefully, the locket on Mara's nightstand gleaming in the dim light, both halves finally united. "We did it," Arabella whispered. "We survived everything and made it here." "We did it together," Steve corrected, "and we're going to keep doing it together. Every day, every challenge, every joy, together." They closed the door softly and retired to their shared bedroom. The first night as husband and wife, marking a new chapter in a story that had been written in tears and hope and love that refused to die. Outside their window, stars shone with the same light that had witnessed countless evenings of painful conversations and gradual healing. The morning would bring new challenges and continued healing because damage done over years wouldn't be erased in months. But they would face it together, partners in every sense, building a future one day at a time until eventually the past hurt less than the present brought joy. And their daughters would grow up watching parents who chose each other daily, who demonstrated that love was action rather than feeling, who proved that broken things could be mended if everyone involved was willing to do the work of healing. Chapter 9. The Mother's Last Strike. Their peace lasted 3 months before Steve's mother made her final move. A social worker appeared at their door one morning while Steve was at a meeting, her expression professionally sympathetic in ways that immediately put Arabella on alert. An anonymous complaint had been filed, citing concerns about the children's welfare, requesting a home evaluation to ensure they were being properly cared for. Arabella knew with sinking certainty who had filed the complaint, even if proving it would be impossible. Steve's mother had found a new weapon, one that didn't require her name on documents. Anonymous complaints couldn't be traced back to their source, and child welfare investigations had to be taken seriously regardless of obvious motivation. The social worker was thorough, inspecting the house and asking questions about the twins' medical care and educational progress. Mara and Lara answered with honest directness, describing their life with enthusiasm that should have made any concerns seem ridiculous. But Arabella knew that investigations had their own momentum, that even unfounded complaints created files and raised questions. Steve returned home to find Arabella shaking with suppressed rage, the social worker's card clutched in her hand. "She did this. Your mother found a way to hurt us that doesn't require showing her face." "We don't know it was her," Steve said, though his tone suggested he agreed. "It could be anyone concerned about the twins' welfare. Don't insult me by pretending this is legitimate concern. Nobody who knows us would file a complaint. This is her revenge for losing in court, for being cut off from your life. She's using the system to terrorize us because she knows we can't prove her involvement." Steve called his lawyer, explaining the situation with barely controlled fury. The lawyer promised to look into it, but his tone suggested there wasn't much to be done about anonymous complaints. They would have to cooperate fully and hope the social worker's report reflected the reality of a loving home. The investigation lasted weeks, with follow-up visits and interviews that felt invasive and exhausting. Lara's medical records were scrutinized, their finances examined, their parenting methods questioned. Every decision they'd made was viewed through lens of potential neglect, and the weight of constant evaluation took its toll on the entire family. Mara started having nightmares about being taken away, waking up crying and needing reassurance. Lara grew quiet and withdrawn, her naturally contemplative nature becoming worrying silence. Steve and Arabella struggled to maintain normalcy while feeling constantly observed and judged. "She's destroying us from a distance," Arabella said one night after the twins finally fell asleep. "Even without direct contact, she's tearing apart the peace we fought so hard to build." "She's trying to," Steve corrected, "but we're not going to let her succeed. The social worker will file her report. It'll show that our daughters are thriving, and this will be dismissed." "And if it's not dismissed? What if she files another complaint? And another, keeping us in constant state of investigation?" Steve had no good answer because he knew his mother's capacity for vindictive persistence. This was war of attrition, designed to exhaust and demoralize until they broke under the weight of constant attacks. The social worker's report came back clean, declaring the home safe and the children well cared for. But the relief was temporary because 2 weeks later, another anonymous complaint was filed, this time claiming homeschooling concerns, even though the twins attended regular school. The pattern became clear. His mother would file complaints until the system grew tired of investigating or until something stuck. Steve made the decision he'd been avoiding, calling his mother directly for the first time since the courthouse confrontation. She answered with cold satisfaction, clearly expecting this capitulation. "Have you come to your senses?" she asked without preamble. "I'm calling to give you one chance to stop this harassment. Stop filing complaints, stop trying to destroy our family, and I'll consider allowing supervised visitation with your granddaughters." His mother's laugh was harsh. "You think you're in position to negotiate? I will continue making your life miserable until you admit that keeping those children from appropriate family influence is damaging them." "You'll never have custody," Steve said with finality. "But you will face consequences if you continue. I've hired investigators to trace the complaints back to you, and when we have proof, I'll file charges for malicious reporting. You'll be the one dealing with legal consequences, not us." "You can't prove anything," his mother said, but her voice held less certainty. "Everything can be traced if you know where to look and have resources to follow the trail. I may not have your money anymore, but I have enough to destroy you if you force my hand. This is your only warning. Stop attacking my family or face the full force of what I'm willing to do to protect them." He ended the call before she could respond, his hands shaking with suppressed fury. Arabella watched from the doorway with an expression that combined fear and pride. "Will she stop? I don't know. But I meant what I said. If she continues this, I'll dedicate every resource I have to proving her involvement and making sure she faces consequences." The complaints stopped after that conversation, a silence that felt ominous rather than reassuring. Steve's investigators found digital trails suggesting the complaints had originated from accounts connected to his mother's social circle, but proof solid enough for legal action remained elusive. They lived with the knowledge that this peace was conditional, that his mother was only one vindictive impulse away from renewing her campaign. But Arabella refused to let that fear control their lives. "She's already taken years from us," Arabella said firmly. "I'm not giving her power over our present and future too. We live our lives, we love our daughters, we build something so strong that her attacks can't shake its foundation." Steve agreed, channeling his anger into productive action. He expanded his work, supporting community programs, investing in initiatives that helped families like the one Arabella had struggled to maintain alone. She grew the Arts Center into something remarkable, serving hundreds of children with programs that addressed not just creativity, but also the social issues that created barriers. Mara and Lara thrived despite the disruptions, their resilience testament to the security their parents had worked to provide. They asked occasionally about their grandmother, and Steve answered honestly that sometimes people who should love us make choices that hurt instead, and that protecting them meant maintaining distance from those people. The twins seemed to accept this explanation with the flexibility of children who trusted their parents to make good decisions. They focused on the family they had rather than the one they were missing, and their contentment proved that love and stability mattered more than complex extended family relationships. One evening, while reviewing the social worker's final report that officially closed all investigations, Arabella found herself crying with relief she hadn't allowed herself to feel during the ordeal. Steve found her in their bedroom, holding the letter that declared their family officially free from scrutiny. "It's over," he said softly. "She can't hurt us anymore without exposing herself to consequences she's not willing to face." Is it really over, though? Or is this just another temporary reprieve? It's over because we're not going to live in fear of what she might do. We're going to live our lives fully, trusting that we've built something strong enough to withstand whatever comes. And if she tries again, we'll handle it together like we've handled everything else. Arabella nodded against his chest, letting his certainty calm her residual anxiety. They'd survived his mother's worst attacks and emerged stronger, their family intact and their love proven through trial by fire. Whatever came next would be faced from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. The locket sat on their mantle now, both halves united and displayed as reminder of their journey. The photographs inside had faded slightly with time, but the meaning remained sharp. Love that survived separation, trust rebuilt after betrayal, family forged from broken pieces. It was their story told in gold and old photographs. Proof that some things were strong enough to survive even determined attempts at destruction. And as Steve and Arabella stood together looking at that symbol of their survival, they both understood with perfect clarity that his mother's final strike had failed, not because they'd defeated her, but because she'd underestimated what they'd become through suffering. They were no longer the scared young people she'd manipulated years ago. They were parents fighting for their children, partners supporting each other, survivors who'd learned that love was strongest when it had been tested and refused to break. Whatever challenges tomorrow brought would be faced together, with the certainty that nothing could destroy what they'd built through determination and refusal to surrender to fear. And their daughters would grow up witnessing that strength, learning that family meant choosing each other daily and protecting what mattered, regardless of cost. Chapter 10. The Family Forged from Fire. 3 years had passed since the courthouse victory, and Steve stood in the doorway of the Arts Center, watching Arabella teach a room full of children with the same passionate engagement that had captivated him a decade ago. The center had grown into something remarkable, occupying an entire building now, with programs that served over 500 children annually. Her dream had expanded beyond anything she'd imagined during those poverty years. Mara and Lara sat in the front row, listening to their mother explain color theory with rapt attention, despite having heard these lessons countless times. They were different now, confident in ways that came from growing up secure and loved. Lara's heart condition was managed through medication and regular checkups, her strength fully returned. Mara had channeled her boldness into leadership, organizing other children and advocating for causes she believed in with fierce determination. Steve's phone buzzed with an unexpected message from his mother's lawyer. She was hosting her annual charity gala that evening and demanding, really, that he attend. The message included a thinly veiled threat about making public statements regarding his choices if he refused to appear. Steve stared at the message and made a decision that had been years in the making. "I need to go somewhere tonight," he told Arabella when she finished her class. "My mother's charity gala. She's threatening to cause problems if I don't show up, and I think it's time we ended this once and for all." "We?" Arabella's eyes widened. "Steve, I can't go to that. Your mother's friends, her entire social circle. That's exactly why you're coming," Steve interrupted gently. "And we're bringing Mara and Lara. It's time everyone in that world sees exactly what my mother tried to destroy, and what we built despite her." The gala was exactly what Steve expected: cold elegance designed to impress, filled with people who measured worth in wealth and connections. His mother held court in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by admirers who hung on her every word. Her face drained of color when Steve walked in with Arabella on one arm and their daughters holding their other hands. "What are you doing here?" his mother hissed when they approached, her smile fixed for the benefit of watching guests. "I invited you alone." "You invited your son," Steve said clearly, his voice carrying to nearby guests who turned to watch the confrontation. "These are my family. My wife Arabella and your granddaughters Mara and Lara, the family you tried to eliminate." His mother's eyes flickered with panic, aware that dozens of her peers were listening. "This is neither the time nor place for family drama. We can discuss this privately." "No," Steve said firmly. "We're done with private discussions where you control the narrative. These people deserve to know who you really are." He pulled out his phone and connected it to the venue's sound system, his investigator having prepared everything in advance. "For years, you've told your friends that I was unstable, that I'd made poor choices, that you were trying to protect me. You painted yourself as a concerned mother, doing what was necessary for her son's well-being." "Stephen, don't do this," his mother said, her voice low and dangerous. "You'll regret what I regret is not doing this sooner." Steve pressed play, and his mother's voice filled the ballroom, recordings from years ago where she detailed her plans to eliminate Arabella from his life. The audio captured her hiring people to forge documents, to create fake photographs, to stage elaborate scenarios designed to convince Arabella that Steve was engaged to someone else. The ballroom had gone completely silent, hundreds of guests listening as his mother's voice described hiring a voice actor to mimic Steve's speech patterns, creating fake bank records, even paying a woman to pose as his fiancée and confront Arabella outside his apartment building. The cruelty in her tone was unmistakable as she laughed about how easily the scholarship girl had been manipulated. "You did what?" One of his mother's oldest friends stepped forward, her face showing genuine shock. "You hired people to destroy your son's relationship? To keep him from his own children?" "This is taken out of context," his mother stammered, her composure cracking. "I was protecting him from someone who was clearly using him." "I have the receipts," Steve interrupted, his investigator distributing folders to key guests. "Every payment she made to the people she hired, every forged document, every staged encounter. She didn't just manipulate Arabella, she manipulated me. She helped me search for Arabella for years while knowing exactly where she was. She knew about my daughters from the day they were born and kept them secret from me. This wasn't protection, this was control." Another recording played, this one capturing his mother discussing her plans to file anonymous child welfare complaints to harass them after losing the custody battle. Her voice was cold and calculated as she explained how to use the system to terrorize them without leaving evidence that could be traced back to her. The crowd's murmur grew louder, guests backing away from Steve's mother as if her cruelty might be contagious. The charity board president approached with fury written across her features. "Is this true? Did you file false child welfare reports?" "They were legitimate concerns," his mother tried to argue, but her voice had lost all conviction. "Those children were being raised in poverty. Without proper poverty you caused." Arabella spoke for the first time. her voice steady despite being surrounded by people who'd once represented everything she feared. "You gave me money to leave your son, then used that poverty as evidence I was an unfit mother. You created every problem you claimed to be concerned about." Mara stepped forward with the fearlessness of a child raised to believe she belonged anywhere. "Are you our grandmother? The one who tried to take us away from Mama?" His mother looked at her granddaughter, and something flickered in her expression. Regret, perhaps, or recognition of what her prejudice had cost her. "I was trying to give you a better life than your mother could provide." "Mama gave us the best life," Lara said quietly from beside her sister. "She taught us to be kind and strong, and to love people for who they are, not what they look like or how much money they have. You're the one who needs to learn that." The simple truth from a child's mouth hit harder than any accusation Steve could have made. His mother's face crumpled, the reality of her isolation finally penetrating her defenses. Her friends, her social circle, the people whose opinion she'd valued above her own family, they were all backing away, their expressions showing disgust or pity or contempt. "I want you to understand something," Steve said to his mother as guests began leaving the gala in scandalized groups. "You didn't lose me because I chose Arabella over you. You lost me because you chose prejudice over love, control over family, and cruelty over compassion. You had every chance to be part of our lives, to know your granddaughters, to be a mother worth having. You chose this isolation yourself." His mother stood alone in the center of her ruined gala, surrounded by the wreckage of her reputation. "You've destroyed me," she whispered. "No," Steve said gently. "You destroyed yourself. I just made sure everyone knew the truth." They left her there and didn't look back. The exposure had been brutal but necessary, the kind of public reckoning that couldn't be undone or explained away. By the next morning, Steve's mother had become a pariah in the social circles she'd once dominated. Her charity positions revoked, her influence obliterated. 2 weeks later, Steve's phone rang with news that his mother had suffered a massive heart attack. She'd been found alone in the estate she'd valued more than family, and the doctors said she'd died quickly, without pain. He felt hollow relief that the threat she'd represented was finally gone permanently, but also profound sadness for what could have been if she'd chosen differently. The funeral was small and sparsely attended, most of her former friends unwilling to be associated with her after the gala revelations. Steve stood with Arabella and their daughters, paying respects to the woman who'd given birth to him, even though she'd stopped being his mother long before she died. After the service, his mother's lawyer approached with an envelope. "She left this for you. Instructions were that you should read it alone." Steve opened the letter in his car, while Arabella waited with the twins at a nearby park. The words were surprisingly honest, acknowledging her manipulation and the damage she'd caused. She wrote about her own upbringing in a world that valued legacy over love, about fear that had driven her to destroy rather than accept. She admitted to every crime Steve had exposed at the gala and more, watching Arabella throughout her pregnancy, knowing about Mara and Lara's births, deliberately keeping them separated. The final paragraph gutted him with its raw honesty. "I watched you build a beautiful family with the woman I tried to eliminate from your life, and I saw that she made you happier than anything I'd ever given you. My prejudice cost me my son and my granddaughters, and I died knowing that was my own fault. I'm leaving you everything I denied you before, not because you need it, but because it's the only apology I can offer now. Tell your daughters that their grandmother was wrong about everything that mattered, and that the greatest regret of my life was choosing pride over love." Steve emerged from the car, with tears streaming down his face, and Arabella wrapped him in her arms while he broke apart over the mother who'd finally found honesty in death. The inheritance was substantial, millions that would secure their family's future and allow the arts center to expand beyond current limitations. But the money mattered less than the acknowledgement, the admission that she'd been wrong and they'd been right to choose love over her approval. That evening, after telling Arabella about the letter's contents, they talked about forgiveness and legacy and what they would teach their daughters about family and choice. "Do you forgive her?" Arabella asked quietly. "After everything she did, knowing she regretted it at the end?" "I'm starting to," Steve said honestly. "The public exposure at the gala gave me the closure I needed. Seeing her face the consequences of her actions in front of everyone she'd tried to impress. The letter gave me understanding. Together, they're enough to start letting go of the anger." "She died alone because of her choices," Arabella said softly. "That's its own kind of tragedy." "It is," Steve agreed. "But it was a tragedy she created. We gave her chances to choose differently. The gala was her final opportunity to admit what she'd done and try to make amends. She could have confessed, apologized publicly, tried to earn forgiveness. Instead, she tried to deny and defend. That was her choice." The twins burst into their bedroom the next morning with boundless energy, demanding pancakes and telling stories about their dreams. They piled onto the bed between their parents, giggling and demanding attention. Steve watched his daughters interact with Arabella and felt overwhelming gratitude for the family they'd created from such broken beginnings. Later that day, they took Mara and Lara to the place where Steve had first walked into the arts center and found Arabella again. The neighborhood had changed, but the building remained, expanded and improved, but still recognizably the place where their family had been reborn. "This is where Daddy found us," Mara said, having heard the story countless times. "When we were little and didn't know he existed." "This is where everything changed," Steve confirmed. "Where I walked through that door and saw your mother teaching children to paint, and my entire world shifted." "And you saw the locket," Lara added, touching the united piece that hung around her sister's neck. "And you knew we were yours." "I knew you were mine the moment I saw you," Steve corrected gently. "The locket just confirmed what my heart already understood." They spent the afternoon in the center, Steve and Arabella working side by side, while Mara and Lara helped younger children with their projects. Watching his family interact with the community they served, Steve felt complete in ways that had nothing to do with wealth or social standing. That evening, they gathered in their home, with the locket displayed prominently on the mantel. Steve pulled it down and opened it carefully, showing the twins the photographs inside that had faded with time, but remained precious. "This is your mother when she was young," he told them, pointing to Arabella's image, "before life made her strong and fierce. And this is me before I knew what really mattered." "You both look happy," Mara observed, "like you didn't know sad things could happen." "We were innocent," Arabella agreed. "We thought love was simple. We didn't understand yet that the best things require fighting for." "But you fought," Lara said with satisfaction. "You fought and won, and now we're all together." "We did," Steve confirmed. "And we'll keep fighting for this family every single day." The twins hugged their parents with fierce affection, completely secure in their place in the world. And as Steve held his daughters and his wife, he thought about the years he'd spent searching and the moment he'd finally found what he'd been looking for all along. The locket caught the light. Both halves united after years of separation, and Steve understood with perfect clarity that some love stories took a decade and almost died 1,000 times, but survived because the people involved refused to accept that broken things couldn't be mended. They'd lost years they could never recover, caused each other pain that left permanent scars, and built their family from wreckage that should have destroyed them. But they'd survived. They'd chosen each other despite every reason not to. They'd forgiven the unforgivable and built something beautiful from devastating betrayal. His mother had tried to destroy them and failed. Her final public defeat at the gala proving that cruelty couldn't triumph over love when people refused to surrender. And their daughters would grow up understanding that love wasn't about perfect people making perfect choices, but about imperfect people choosing each other daily and refusing to surrender when things got difficult. The search that had consumed Steve for so many years had ended not with finding Arabella, but with finding himself, the man he was meant to be, the father his daughters deserved, the husband who chose love over pride and family over legacy. The locket sat on the mantel as permanent reminder of their journey, both halves united. Photographs faded but precious, promise kept despite years of separation. It was their story told in gold and old memories, proof that love strong enough to survive years apart was strong enough to build a future on. And every time Steve looked at it, he remembered the moment he'd seen it around his daughter's neck and known with certainty that some things were worth searching the entire world to find.